So it looks like I'm doing a little bit of a mad dash to the finish line with these video reviews. I've been going back and I've been looking at each and every Ayreon album since the beginning. And I've been reviewing each of these albums one per month in lead up to The Source. The last one that I did was his 7th studio album of 010110001. And now we come to The Theory of Everything. Let's dive in and examine this theory of everything. The Theory of Everything by Ayreon. So The Theory of Everything is the 8th studio album by this... I don't want to necessarily call it a band. Like, for those of you who have stuck around this far, pretty much know what Ayreon is all about. It's being helmed by Arjen Lucassen, and Arjen is kind of the mastermind behind the whole thing. He writes and produces the entire album, but in terms of performing, he's more a minimalistic approach. He usually contracts out differently talented individuals to produce all the vocals and the guitar works and the synthesizers. This particular work is much like a lot of his past works. It is a double disc full-on concept album. The storyline on this one is a father and a son trying to figure out the overall theory of everything. And this is also the first album that, even though it is a little bit on the scientific side of things, isn't a full-on sci-fi concept. Like all of his other albums take place either with an alien race or some kind of a very heavy-handed sci-fi element. The only one that deviated to a certain extent is the human equation, but even that had a little bit of a sci-fi aspect to it. This one is completely removed from that. So with The Theory of Everything, we're following a father who is obsessed with creating this theorem to kind of prove the theory of everything. And he is just obsessed with it. And his son, who is a brilliant savant in creating and working with mathematics. So throughout the story, it's kind of like a Tommy in the focusing in of the child, or at least his development as a young adult. And it kind of ebbs and flows within his relationships. His relationship with his mother, his relationship with love interest, definitely his relationship with the father, which wasn't seen on Tommy, or even much of these kind of concept albums, which I actually enjoy the fact that they focus so much in with the father figure, because when you look at other concept albums that deal with this kind of a dynamic between relationships, the father figure is always absent. Like Tommy, it was absent. The Wall, it was absent. It's only really the mother figure, or at least an allegory for the mother figure, that's there. You don't really have the father figure. So I like the fact that this one really had a heavy emphasis on the dynamic between the father and the son. You have this experimentation. That's where the story really starts to develop. They go to a psychiatrist and this doctor character, and the doctor character prescribes this medication that will basically help the child focus in. They're saying, you know, the side effects come with delusions and disassociate even more from reality, and is it really worth the cost? And so the father definitely thinks so, but the mother definitely does not, as well as a lot of other ones. So the father actually goes behind the back and starts giving the child the drugs, even like without the consent of the child as well. And so we're following this child develop and maintain relationships, and the child has relationships even with a rival, where he goes to school, and even though the rival is trained and he's got this passion, the rival is excelling, but once the child really starts to come into his own, he starts to overshadow him. And so now we have another characteristic dynamic there. It follows the entire child, and kind of summarizing the whole storyline here. Once the child is, graduated from school, he has to team up with the rival in order to procure more of the drug for the child to really help out. He's almost inherited this desire, this passion, this obsession with the theory of everything and trying to prove it or trying to bring it to fruition. And so by doing so, he's almost betraying his love interest. So you've got that, another really juicy dynamic that's going on there. Finally, the whole thing kind of comes to a head with this father and son working together and creating this theorem that explains everything. It's the theory of everything. That is a summarization of the entire storyline here. And I love the fact of how rich the storyline is on this one. As with all of Ayreon's albums, the story is really what really shines on here. Even though it's not a huge sci-fi, as I was saying with my review with the human equation, what really is grounded is the human characteristics that we find on here. It's the relationships that everybody has. It's not necessarily the passion or the quest for the theory of everything, but how the relationships between everybody intermingles within that. And that has always been what I latch onto the most when I'm dealing with an Ayreon album. Now, I also need to point out some of the guest stars, because that's another crowning jewel of an Ayreon album, is all the guest stars that we have on here. Unlike a lot of the past albums, I'm not too familiar with many of the vocalists on here. Like, I know of the bands, like we definitely have JB from Grand Magnus, we have Sarah from Ancient Brides, we have Michael Mills as the father, and he came from Tohinder, I think is how you pronounce that. You have Christina coming in from Lunatic Coil. You have Marco coming in from Nightwish and Tarot. But the main guy that I know of is the late John Wetton from Asia and King Crimson. And that is one thing that's very present on this album, is how much it feels like that throwback to, say, the 70s progressive rock concept album. Even the structure of the album itself is more or less that double concept album in its more traditional form. Each song, and I'm actually going to use the term suite here, because each of the suites take up a good 20-minute chunk that can be found on a pressed vinyl for 4 tracks or 4 suites. And then each of these suites are divided into tracks. I'm not sure if I agree about it being subdivided into tracks. I think there's, like, I don't listen to albums that way, so I don't know why it would have been presented in that sense, especially when the tracks are so short. Like, each of these tracks are maybe at the very maximum about 5 minutes. A lot of the tracks are like 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Maybe it's a little bit of a more digestible chunk, but for me, it's the whole suite that I find on the album piece. And joining John Wetton from the classic progressive rock bands, we have Steve Hackett from Genesis providing an amazing guitar solo within track 2, or the first part of the suite. We have Rick Wakeman from Yes providing a beautiful piano suite that we found again on track 2. We also have the late great Keith Emerson on keyboards providing a beautiful synth, almost throwback to his earlier works with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And that's bled straight into Jordan Rudess's solo, and both of these provide an amazing kind of contrast and call and answer, where you have the torch from the 70s being passed on to more of a modern progressive rock artist, such as Jordan Rudess from Dream Theater. So those blend with many other grand solos, but those individuals are kind of like the main guest stars on here. So it is very a heavy progressive rock album in that sense. Like, it's less of a metal album from Ayreon's kind of perspective, and more of a progressive rock album. In some ways, this works to its advantage. We're getting a lot more of the fan base from the progressive rock community just dying for this album and loving it. It is very dense and it is very complex in that kind of a structure. And in that regard, I do enjoy it. The drawback, though, to this, and it's not necessarily a drawback, it's just more of an inherent presentation of music, is because it's so complex and so dense, you're not as, I guess, drawn to it, much like other progressive rock concept albums in the past. For example, the one behind me, is it takes multiple listens to really get into the music on this. And I found that particularly on this album, I had to listen to it for almost a year to really get into it, because when I first listened to this album, I was a little bit disappointed. I wasn't connecting to the songs. I wasn't really getting the album, and there were only a few points that I was really enjoying the music that was on here. Like, I enjoyed all of the guest work that we had on here from all those superstars from the past, and hearing them again in this new presentation was a treat to my ears, and one that really made this album one that I would come back to. The main theme from this album, the one that kind of starts off the album and is reintroduced at the beginning of the first suite, at the end of the first suite, and then at the end of the last suite. That kind of theme I thoroughly enjoyed, and it's probably my favorite theme from any of the Ayreon albums, and it's this one here. And the only other one that I really latched onto and really blasted was the theme that introduced the fourth suite, and that is the one that sounds like this. than those suites and other than those, it was more of a challenge for me to really get into this album. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I love to be challenged, and I love to have my kind of theory of music challenged. Did it pay off in the end? I'm not 100% sure. The jury is still out, even though this album's been out for almost 3 years. Actually, it's over 3 years now. But even within that time, I would still come back to this album and still find a reward from it. Like, even now, I'm still getting rewarded by listening to this album, and that is something that's really hard to do with an album these days. My other concern is I love the first suite so much. Like, I love where this goes. I love all of the interplays between the artists, and it almost feels top heavy in this sense because most of the really big standout guest appearances occur in the first suite. So once we come into the second and third suite, I'm not overly all that invested. Like, I'm still following the story and I'm still enjoying where the story is going, but in terms of the music, I'm not as connected. And it isn't until the fourth suite where I'm starting to come back again, and that's within the introduction and then the ending. Overall, this album is, in my mind, one of the more interesting albums that Ayreon has put out, and that definitely shows with how the fans and critics have received it. It is one of the higher rated albums, even though I wouldn't really put it on the top tier. I'd put it in the top 3. Like, definitely my favorites, you know, I'm gonna just lay it all on the table here. Like, my favorite is definitely The Human Equation, then followed by 01, and then this one's probably the third, then followed by The Universal Migrator Part 1. So each of these albums bring a different facet to the Ayreon identity. And so it's really for that reason that I have to say my overall final verdict for this album in terms of a rating, you gotta find this album on physical format, because just the way that this album is broken up, it begs to be listened to on vinyl if you can find it. You wouldn't listen to this on shuffle, on an iPod. You would listen to it on vinyl on a turntable. And so that's really how this album needs to be digested. And so that's about it for the Theory of Everything by Ayreon. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting below. And thank you guys so much for watching. And of course, I'm going to have the source put out very soon. I know it's being released. I thought it was going to be released at the end of this month, but apparently it's getting released on Friday. So you'll have that soon. And I also have a very exciting video coming out very soon. So I'm not going to give too much away because it's a little bit of a surprise, but keep your eyes open for that. That should be coming up at the end of this week. We'll see how that plays out. And so, yes, that's it from me. I'm also reminding everybody that I'm very closely approaching my 1,000th subscriber, and once that happens, I have 2 videos that I'm going to be releasing. The first is a surprise thank you to all of my viewers out there. It's already pretty much done. Like, all of the footage has been captured, and so I just need to kind of edit. I haven't had that fire under my belly to kind of put me in there because I'm still about 30 subscribers away. But the other video that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about each of the albums that I have in my collection behind me. I'll go through cubby by cubby, so that'll probably be, I think that's like 5 or 6, maybe even 7 videos coming your way. But I won't be recording those until I get to the 1,000 subscribers. So if you haven't done so already, definitely do so. So thanks again, everybody, for watching, and until next time, notes out.